I feel so lucky today to be speaking to Benjamin Labatut, the author of the book, The Maniac, among others, that we read in book club, which is so extraordinary. Benjamin is a Chilean author born in the Netherlands, but living in Chile now. He's the author of Antarctica Starts Here, a short story collection, After the Light, a series of scientific, philosophical, and historical notes on the void, The Stone of Madness, and also When We Cease to Understand the World in 21 before he published The Maniac. It has been translated into over 30 languages and is also extraordinary. Thank you so much for talking to me today, Benjamin.
No, thank you so much, Natalie. This is a pleasure.
Formally, you do so many interesting things in the book. There's sometimes pages that have just one sentence. You write the story of this great thinker, John von Neumann, from different points of view, and each one has a different voice. How did you decide on that form? And at what point in the writing did you make those choices?
You're talking to me at the exact right time, because I usually once the book is done, once the book takes form, it seems like there could have been no other way to do it. So I usually kind of brush those questions off. But now that I'm trying to write again, I realize that it's a pretty esoteric process, in the sense that it comes from the materials of the investigation. It's because I don't like to write fiction, because I try to include as little fiction as I can. It's sort of the shapes of these stories have a lot to do with the available information. The tone also comes from there. Like I'm writing now, and I've just found the text written by this woman called Mary Everest Boole, and she just sets the tone for the entire chapter about a mathematician, just because I found a paragraph that expresses what I'm thinking in a way that I could never do it. And then I just kind of write on from there. It's a found material sort of approach. I dedicate a lot of time into not deciding what shape the book should have. Letting whatever, because and I'm lucky in the sense that I like things that are quite abstract, so there's not always that much information about that, and I'm interested in a very specific part. Like I might be fast. I wrote this entire little novella about quantum mechanics just because of one term in an equation, which is the wave function. The wave function is this unsolvable, unthinkable mystery to this day. And I started studying that simple term, which has a beautiful shape in the equation. And I went from the wave function to a novella. It's hard to explain how I get there, but it has a lot to do with something I think a lot of artists will say in their interviews, that you have to get out of the way. I think it's a terrible habit for people who, they say, I'm writing a novel. And I'm like, how the fuck do you know that it's a novel?
Right.
And if you already know, well, the novel has a certain shape. I just don't do that. I work with separate texts, and I let them kind of infect each other. And then wild ideas will come, like those one-liners that you referred to. That was supposed to be a sort of disembodied voice of the computer, of the maniac, speaking, telling its father's story. And I said, oh, that's a great idea. That's a wonderful idea. And it didn't work. And then my editors were like, well, then you have to take it out because it didn't work. And I'm like, no, I'll just leave it in. I like it. And they're like, but who's talking? The Germans. My first editor was like, who is it? And I'm like, it's the computer. But you see, it's very haphazard, and it hangs together in ways that I try and do as much as I can to sort of not write with my forebrain that much.
You write a lot of the political situation of the time, with many of the scientists and mathematicians being Jews during Nazi era. What do you think is gained from understanding the political context of scientific or mathematical investigation?
Not much. I think I include as little as I can, really. In my books, those things are really cut to the bone because I'm much more interested in other things. I think that I give a little context, and I usually, if I write about a period like the rise of the Nazis, is because it's a way to deal with transcendental evil, much in the way that when I write about equations, I'm not just interested. I'm not interested in science, as I know it can be contradictory, but I'm
What?
interested yes, I am interested in singularities. The thing is that you cannot write about it's a Wittgensteinian problem. The things that I want to write about are the things that you cannot write about. It's the things that language will not allow you to express.
Hmm.
The reason why I have chosen science is because it actually, by speaking of science, the edges of science, the unthinkable parts of science, the moments of singularity, both in equations, both in the sense of people like von Neumann, who is like a human-shaped singularity, the edges of thought, the things that we cannot think about. So I use the stories of science to write about what fascinates and excites me, which is the unknowable and the incomprehensible and the inexpressible. And those are the things that sort of fascinate me the most. But you cannot, those are things which are clothed in silence.
You focus a lot on the kind of unknowability of the future impact of what you create, of what you invent, what you discover. There's a quote, it's almost impossible to foretell the consequences and applications of ideas and discoveries. And why it is so hard to properly judge even the realities that we have taken part in ourselves. So how do you think that outlook on the world and on your own creation affects your meaning and purpose and doing good?
Well, we grope forward blind. That's what we do, with our hands before our eyes. And that means that we don't just depend on reason and thinking. We depend on touch to keep us safe. It is our defects. It is the things that we think that cause us pain and suffering, these things that so many of my scientists, so many of really would want to live in a clockwork world of wonderful logic where everything makes sense. And we don't live in that world. And we are contradictory creatures. We are full of these contradictions. So the question with this is that, what do you do with paradox? What do you do with a world that doesn't make sense? And my only answer is that you hold that in your heart. That's it. You hold contradiction and paradox in your heart. You understand that uncertainty is one of the highest forms of truth. You understand that you can have all the power, wisdom, knowledge of the world and suffer like a madman. That you can, and this is, you make peace with the human condition. And that's why the Maniac begins with a man who suffers, because suffering is a way of knowledge too. We forget this, literature doesn't. Readers are sad. People who read, mostly you read alone, and you usually read because you're sad. I've never seen anybody I don't know. I know there's books that can make you laugh, but there is a certain melancholy to thought, to deep thought. It comes with the territory, So I think in the 20th century, we are all very much aware that meaning is something that you build, not something that you simply inherit or participate in. You have to sort of shape it. You have to sort of, and that also requires, at least I believe that it also requires to at times leave your reason behind and participate in other ways of knowledge, in ways that are quite archaic. So to me, that's basically it. We walk forwards knowing that we cannot see past our noses, right? And we have other parts of the body which also come in handy.
Mm. Yeah, when you say that you sometimes go back to it, the archaic, I found it so moving when I hope isn't spoiling for anyone who hasn't read it yet, but when he's on his deathbed and he wraps tefillin, and it was so moving to see him kind of return to that very primal kind of ritual.
And yet it's not a road that is available to us anymore, because you cannot step outside of paradise and then kind of pop back in. No, we cannot do that. So with von Neumann, the tefillin part, I have to say, is made up. But he did sort of, at the end, the way he died is like a parable unto itself, because you cannot think your way past death, because there are no consolations that come from reason. Reason is like the goddess at the beginning of the book, something that will step on your neck until it chokes you, you know? So, but we have other things. We have consciousness. Consciousness is not the same as reason. It's not the same as thinking. Consciousness is at least, it can be understood in many ways, but a fully developed consciousness would at least have let von Neumann understand that while he was going to die, everything else, everything he had ever loved, would go on after him, which is, like, to me, the only consolation that you can offer to anyone, you know, who's facing the darkness of death. It's like, well, yes, you will die. Everything else, still there.
Speaking of some of his creations that continue after him, you highlight the naming of many of his inventions or developments. Mutually assured destruction. The concept is MAD, mad, and the Maniac, of course, is mathematical analyzer, numerical integrator, and computer, and even game theory has such a unique name. And how do you feel that the naming of things affects their impact in the world or how we see them?
We used to be very aware that names had power. And there are many traditions where you are either given a secret name or you give it to yourself. When you deal with the occult, the main thing is to know who you're talking to know their name. But for a writer, these things are sort of just gifts. They just, because you're aware that each word properly used can, like Philip K. Dick said, no, the certain words said in a certain order can destroy you or they can save you. The Maniac had many names, Maniac, Johnniac, but of course they realized that there was something manic in the world ever since computers increased the velocity of our civilization a millionfold, and it's coming back. I I think that something like DALI and ChatGPT it scares me because it's such a shit name, because it has no gravitas. It's because we're dealing with something that is supposed to, it's actually putting into question, consciousness, intelligence, billions, trillions are being invested, and these people don't know because they don't have what von Neumann had, breadth of culture, someone who knew how civilizations rise and fall, someone who had a Promethean gift, because they're not reading the Vedas like Oppenheimer did. So we have a world which is sort of tick-tocking its way towards the apocalypse. It would be funny if it wasn't so sad.
Yes, it's true. You write, for progress, there is no cure. So why did you want to use the language of illness to describe it?
Well, I didn't write that. That is von Neumann. And let me just kind of finish the quote because it's because I'm a dark person, so I cut out the last part. He basically says, "For progress, there is no cure, but hey, remember, it's us who do these things so we can find ways to use technology." No, technology is like indifferent. He always said, science is indifferent. Technology is indifferent. It's up to us, it's up to human beings. The world is made this way by us, and we can do it in another way. No, that's kind of what I left out because I don't like to end up on a high note. I'd rather be dead than optimistic. And made a joke and now I forgot the question.
Just what that using the language of illness,
Oh,
cure
illness.
to describe progress, like what
That's a
that
big,
that
it's a big part of my literature because it's always been a big part of my life. I am illness, sadness, depression, the body itself, like I think Cronenberg's movies are sort of like a reminder that for many of the ills of the mind, there is the body. There is always the body. I write about a lot of these men who, to me, it's like you should have gone to the beach a little bit more, ride a bike, have sex. No, it's like the body is and the body, we all know it's like an endless source of pain and pleasure. Every waking moment, while you're sitting there, right? Your legs are gonna bother you. It's always there. It's always, and we tend to think in these very dualistic terms. So disease is something that for some reason, which I don't know myself, creeps into everything I write. And because I like ideas that are incarnate. I think when I don't write about ideas that don't have a strong correlation to someone's body and soul, I would say, right? Otherwise they're dead. Because there's so many things to write about. Like, and people tell me like, why don't you write about this? And I'm like, but because that's just an idea and that's just an equation. However, when something like the Schwarzschild equation infects the body of its maker, no, it's like it's an old Christian thing. The word, when the word becomes flesh, you have a
right.
transformative event. And if it doesn't, it's just a word. And this
Mm.
happens a lot with books. It happens a lot with books. If they don't have a spirit in them, if they are not created from and contain some part of the spirit, they're just words on paper. They don't come alive.
The game that you have at the last segment of the book, Go, I had never heard of and was so fascinated to read about that. This game that uses intuition and creativity. How did you learn about it? How did you come to want to use that specific game as a sort of end note for this story of von Neumann?
That's the thing. The book is not a story about von Neumann. It just seems that way because people tend to believe that because it's the main part of the book. But to me, each of the three stories that the book contains, to me, are like connected but precious on their own. And I found about the Go games between AlphaGo and Lisadol, just like everybody else, when AlphaGo made move 37. It does this one move, and there were shockwaves among the more nerdier parts of the web, which is the ones that I like. And people were like, and to me, a writer's job is to have a sort of ear out for miracles. It's really about that. You have to understand when the word becomes flesh. You have to understand when some, I don't know, peasant somewhere goes into a cave and becomes enlightened. You have to be aware of that. When the miraculous happens, it's going to change the world. And I knew it as soon as I read the first article. I'm like, this is going to change the world. And so as soon as it happened, I started consuming information about it. And I had heard about Go because an old girlfriend of mine used to make me jealous by playing Go with her teacher. And we would play chess, but she would play Go with him. So, and she never taught me how to play. And, but Go is a beautiful, beautiful thing that has, in a certain sense, been kind of despiritualized by this AI. It has sort of, because it used to represent a model of sheer absolute complexity. And it was like a mirror of the complexity of the universe. And it was like a tiny model of our minds. Because it was so complex, players could never calculate a play. So they had to feel it out because our brains do these things, the back of our minds, the one that is not in charge of tying our shoelaces, can do these spectacular things that we're not aware of them. They happen unawares. And that's how they played. So then when they did this thing that could sort of beat us at this very human thing, right? It was like, it wasn't Kasparov playing Deep Blue. It was an algorithm battling our unconscious,
Mm.
subconscious, and we got beat very badly. So even though it happened there, to me, it was okay. This is not just technology. This is actually technology that is putting our soul at hazard. And well, you have to pay attention to those things as a writer, I think.
No, it's chilling when you feel that, yeah, instinct could be replicated. There's a part where I think it's a quote from Turing about how it would have to be true artificial intelligence would have to be fallible, that would allow for this kind of variety of possibilities that would kind of allow for the best, I guess, things to win the evolution race. How do you feel that fallibility of AI is helpful, dangerous with the uses that we're seeing today?
The word I would use is fascinating, in the sense that when that entire chapter, the last part of the book is called "The Delusions of Artificial Intelligence," because when the AI that is completely destroying the human player suddenly becomes delusional, when it kind of goes crazy, when it no longer knows what's happening on the board, these kind of flaws that we see in the system, isn't it fascinating that when you create a large language model, well, if you push up the dial on its intelligence, it delirium pops out. To me, that is just, as a writer, it's like, hell yes. I mean, that's the way it works. Nobody perceives reality like it is. We add layers and layers of meaning on top of everything. Nothing is ever just, no, it's never just a glass or a t-shirt. It's covered with the layers of our mind. So and it's also wonderful because it makes them unreliable. And so it makes them flawed. And these are the kind of things that give me hope, because and in the book I kind of tried and show, like, listen, take your equations and run them. It's like scientific thinking and rational thinking is a bit like the human life, right? It's going to end in death. So if you run these equations, they will lead you to mutually assured destruction. Every scenario is the end of the world. People are, blowing their brains out because of AI. And then life just keeps going because it's a messy, non-deterministic system. And even when it is deterministic, it's chaotic, so unpredictable. So, like, there are certain things about modern science that are a blessing and a curse, no? Like, we couldn't believe, if we ever understand our minds completely from the point of view of the individual, we will remain mysterious. We're never going to be able to look inside the black box, and we cannot look inside these black boxes. So these defects, these hallucinations, these delusions, the excess of meaning, are kind of the curse that is a blessing.